And the final talk of the session, token-based authorization. So we're back to a more technical topic.
So this is going to be a different talk. Thank you, John. It was also put together a little bit on short notice, but I'm going to talk about authorization. I'm not going to talk about authentication today. And I'm not going to talk about things like my access ID and Indigo IAM and stuff. I will pick on Indigo IAM a bit as we go along, but that's because it's being used by IRIS. I'm sort of talking with an IRIS hat on and an UKSRC hat on and an SKA hat on, and having worked with the SGF as well. And yeah, so there are things that will overlap between a lot of the user communities. Right. So the use case we're looking at, there are actually lots of use cases, like user stories and stuff behind this, but really the core one is a user wants to access a service and they need to have authorization to access that service. So that's the thing we're going to look at today, and specifically using tokens to do that flow. Now, the general sort of slightly community-based view of the architecture looks a bit like this. This is from the ARC projects. So the idea is that there's a community, which could be UKSRC, it could be a community within SKA or something, or communities inside of IRIS like DRAC, or somebody, a sub-community inside of DRAC, who are doing their stuff, and they manage their authorizations within that community, who's doing what within the community, and they connect that into the infrastructure. So the distinction there is users authenticate with their home organization ID into the community AI, and the community AI authenticates them into the infrastructure proxy, and the infrastructure proxy mediates their access to all of the services inside of the infrastructure. And that is the way to achieve scalability at the cost of having an extra layer for the user to connect through. So that's sort of the foundation of what I'm going to talk about. Now, let's look at the authorizations then, because there are lots of parties involved. If you go back to that slide from before, users start with a home organization where their authorization would be, this is your affiliation, and this is the assurance behind your authentication, behind your account. We'll see an example of that later. From the community, they get, yes, you are a member of the community. You may have a specific role, something that you're doing in the community. From the infrastructure, you may get an authorization. Yes, I recognize your community. I have no idea who you are, but I recognize the community and I will let you in. From the site, you may just see whether you're banned or not. The sites will generally have the rights to ban individual users at the site level if they feel that the user has not behaved well enough. And then at the resource, there will be resource-specific authorizations like access control lists and stuff that the resource will need to go through and check. So if you want to play along, not necessarily now, but when you get home, I was in a hotel room or something on the train, if you're connected, set up a Debian system where you can install OIDC agent and you can play along a bit, because you can basically do this. You can install the OIDC agent, you can start the agent, and if you're connecting to IRIS IAM, you will basically just provide, like after, when you run OIDC gen, then it will prompt you for stuff. And the things I put after the dots is what you type into the next prompts to set up an account. It sort of assumes you have an IRIS account, but and the asterisks are the passwords, where you type the passwords for your new account, just in case you want to try it for yourself. This flow, when you set up an account and you log in, requires you to go and log into IRIS to authorize that agent that you just set up. And here's one of my first things to highlight is when you log into IRIS, it puts the least desirable method of authentication first. And the most desirable method of authenticating is hidden at the bottom of the screen. Right. So this is really annoying. I mean, from a user's perspective, so Phil mentioned the usability, like user's perspective, this is bad design. but they all do this. I'm picking on Iris IAM, Indigo IAM, but they all do this, like keycloak, username, password. If you play along, these are the next steps. So you basically get a token from the account you just set up, and you use that token to run a query. And you can also say how soon the token expires. The one you get from Iris IAM has a lifetime of 1 hour. And this is essentially what it looks like when you run that command. So this, I'm not expecting you to read this, but basically it's got entitlements that say which groups I'm in. So you can see I'm in STFC Cloud Prod. I don't know if you can see my cursor. And you can see these come in as entitlements, and there are various sort of user level attributes, and then my authorization attributes as entitlements. And they all scoped as sort of namespace scoped, so that when you start putting things together, they don't collide with each other. They're all namespaced. If you did the same thing on EGI check-in, there is pretty much the same stuff coming out. You will notice here that there's a section about the level of assurance that I've got from EGI check-in, or rather from my home organization when I register with EGI check-in. And my authorizations come out in a slightly different way. Where are they now? These things. Because they come out as person entitlement attributes rather than entitlements on this side. So there's some interoperability issues here. And again, this is just to highlight that they all have things that need fixing. Also, it shouldn't say example here. The attributes you get from Iris IAM if you're eagle-eyed, but that surely can be fixed. Now, in my architecture, I had the community authenticating through to the infrastructure proxy. If you look at Iris IAM as an infrastructure proxy, then you could look at SAFE as a community, if you come from DRAC, for example. Now, I will have an authorization in DRAC, which you can see on the right-hand side. This is my DRAC account, and it was very kindly set up by Jeremy, who gave me access so I could test stuff. But the trouble here is my authorization from SAFE is not passed through Iris IAM. So when I finally connect to the service, which in this case would be the cloud that we provide to Iris, it has no idea what my role is in DRAC, the role that's managed in SAFE, because they're not passed through. And that's a little bit rubbish, because it now means I need to connect through directly with SAFE into the infrastructure, which may be okay, but still, generally in the architecture, if we want the community AI to pass authorization attributes through to the service, they need to go through the infrastructure proxy, because that was what the flow in the architecture, and they don't. OIDC agents, if you were playing along, you might find it slightly annoying. You can't specify the groups and roles. We have people in SK who are members of 20, 30 odd groups or something, and they find that their tokens just expand like a big lump of stuff. And it might be much nicer that you just specify the roles and the groups you want to be a member of today, so that you have the minimal set of authorizations for the work you want to do. We had this problem in EUDAT back in, like Juan mentioned. The login system is not clairvoyant. It doesn't know what you want to do, but the user knows what they want to do. So when you log in to the system, you could say, well, actually, I'm going to be SAFE DRAC today because I want to do DRAC stuff. So I don't have my SKA authorizations or my Iris IAM authorizations or other things. I just have the minimal set of authorizations that I need to do my work. And only I know that. The systems that I'm logging into do not know that. So that is, I'm planning to, ideally, hopefully I can prepare a demo for next week of this kind of thing working as a bit of prototypey stuff. So basically asserting what I can, because by default, the whole lump of authorizations known to the system is passed into the infrastructure proxy. Geo69 is the way of connecting things together. If you want things to connect, they need to be namespace, as we saw before. So the namespaces there are some technical details, but the nice thing about it is not just that the group memberships will not step on each other's toes, it's also that you know where the authorization came from at a high level. So if you say UN Giant IAM example group STFC Cloud Prod, it says this authorization came from the IAM, which should have said Iris in this case, but you know where the authorization came from because it has at least at a coarse-grained level, because you have an authorization on it. So it's kind of a good thing to do. However, if you want to turn this on, then the group names get longer because you have this namespace extension on them. And there are some subtle issues about things, like it's hard to do negative selections about generally. And there are a few other things, like you still need to trust if the tokens, like ID tokens and stuff, if they're signed, you also need to trust whoever signed that, which might be the community AI, but you're sitting in the infrastructure proxy or in the service trying to validate a token, and you don't necessarily have the certificate of the thing that signed that token. So there's a bit of glue as well to do. And to give you an example of this, suppose we look at FTS again. The user submits a transfer into FTS. The FTS submits a transfer request into the destination. Destination calls out to the source saying, please transfer that file to me, or it pulls the file possibly. So if you look at the authorizations, so the user needs to have read access on the source, it needs to have write access to the destination, and it needs to have permissions to use FTS, because FTS itself is a resource. FTS needs to use that authorization to basically do what the user needed to do on the source and destination. FTS does not have any rights in itself. It can only use the user's authorizations. It must use the user's authorizations. In turn, the destination needs to be able to read the source file, and because it needs to call out to the source saying, please give me the file. And then those authorizations come from the user, but now they need to be enforced. So the source needs to enforce the authorization to read the file, and the destination needs to enforce the authorization to write the file into its destination. And FTS obviously will have enforced the access right to use FTS, because otherwise it wouldn't have done the transfer in the first place. So when we talk about authorizations, we also need to look at enforcements. So in the SAML language, they have the PEPs and the PIPs and all these things, and they're quite helpful, I think, to think about things, because there is no authorization without the enforcement of the authorization. And we'll see another example of this shortly. So when you have lots of groups, one of the suggestions that are floating around out there is, well, instead of just giving you a long list of all the groups like we're doing at the moment, then why don't we just give you the most specific groups and then assume that the membership of a subgroup implies membership of the parent group. So that means that the list of 3 groups that I got in this example, you can just publish the most specific one, and the system will automatically assume that you are in the parent group as well. This only works if the subgroup authorization is a superset of the parent group authorization. And you can work this out by hand, like if you sit down and sort of noodle it out on a piece of paper. So there are counterexamples to this that people come up with, that maybe I want a subgroup to be able to read the files, but I want everybody in my collaboration to be able to write the files if they're not in a subgroup. But remember, I told you before, it's very hard to do negative selections on group memberships. So probably that's a bad idea, but this is one of the examples people come up with. The other thing is, if you're the blind party, if you're the service, you need to do a substring match, because you now get the most specific role in the group, rather than a full string for each of the groups that the user is in. Moving on, federated access on using SSH. I was going to put a link in for the PAN module, but I missed that. Sort of because that's not just about authorization, it's also about creating and removing accounts. Because when users come in, when do you create accounts for users? You don't want to create accounts for everyone, because there could be hundreds of people in MICEs, and you might want to do, you might have 5 of them logging into your systems. So you may also want to not just create accounts on the fly, because you want to know who they are and maybe authorize them specifically or something. So there are some subtle things around authorizations. Another thing to look at is, can you move a team around as if it were a person? So you may have a support team that works simultaneously with different, or a deployment team or some such that works simultaneously with several user groups. And you want them to sort of join a group and remove them from the group again. And you want to, at the same time, manage the team as if it were a group, so that you can join people into the team and you remove them again. So this is one of the use cases that is covered by the hierarchical naming. It's fine, it's easy to do, but it's not covered by the management tools we have at the moment. Token exchange. The stuff I showed you with FTS, with things talking to other things and delegating things, really should happen with token exchange, and that is what FTS expects. And there are lots of things in token exchange that are very interesting and useful, but and we should use them more, I think. But what happens? What I want to look at is what you have when you have multiple OpenID providers, the OPs. Because you could potentially exchange a token from one OP from another OP. So the protocol is very generic and is very powerful. You can do lots of things with it, but mostly people just do the simple things like dropping privileges and doing delegations or getting refresh tokens for a token. But we could use it as a workhorse to solve more problems. If we had the ability to do exchanging tokens from one OP to that of another OP, or maybe extending what tokens can do for some things. But it's very hard then to provide policies that actually authorize that issuance of stronger tokens, because it's something that people never think about. So usability, Phil mentioned the usability of things. Many of these tools are actually quite difficult to use. If you played along at home, you might find that you get error messages and stuff that are quite obscure. OIDC agent tends to not give you an error message until the end, rather than saying sort of, as soon as you put something in that's wrong, it says, oh, actually, this doesn't look right. But no, it goes through the whole workflow, lets you type your password and stuff, and then it gives you an error message at the end, even if what you put in was wrong. That was wrong comes in at the beginning. Some of the users we're going to work with will have a low tolerance for this thing. So we just heard about the early grid users with their certificates and stuff. Or as Phil mentioned with the users, we never do user experience testing for our tools. And if at some point we do, we ignore the results. Like we never make things easier to use. So I've rattled through a lot of topics just to sort of getting things off my chest. And the purpose of that was basically to identify things that I think we could work on. So what I want us to do is to go and apply to the network to get funding, to say, here are all the things we want to fix. I picked a little bit on Indigo IAM, but there's, as I said, all the tools have the same issues generally across the board. And these are things we could go and fix that I've tried to highlight today, even if I sort of rattle through a lot of different topics. And when we fix those, there's more things to look at. So that I haven't covered today. And when we've done those, there will be more things still, like how do you establish trust between different proxies, and how do you validate tokens from one OP to another OP, and various other things. How do we make use of OpenID Connect Federation whenever it comes around to being a usable thing? I also want to highlight Ian's workshop. Have I got this right?
Where did the QR code go to? The URLs.
I don't think I have the QR code.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
That's not the slide I swear. No, doesn't matter.
This was the one I had. So I've highlighted the registration URL in red so that so you can come and find it and type it in, and we'll just go back to this. Finally, I'll just to put a shout out to some of my colleagues and collaborators who have started picking away at some of these issues, so shout outs to them. But I'll leave you with a slide from Ian for the workshop in Reading. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being able to put something together at the last minute. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Right, do we have some questions?
I can tell, gents, that we have actually fixed the direct login. We were working it, Donald and I were working it yesterday during the conference. So,
Splendid. Thank you.
Thank you.
So a live book fix.
Excellent. Collaboration in action. So I have some thoughts. I think have you got something set up? I find this stuff sort of technically fascinating, but it's also interesting that tying it into our previous talks about governance and whatever, this is the implementation of that policy, of how do we actually manage access to systems and establish those relationships in a technical sense, the technical implementation of the policy.
Yeah.
And so it is terribly important to be able to get this right, because we can write all the policies we want and agree how we are going to interoperate and how we're going to agree to work.
Yeah.
But if the technical implementation doesn't embody that in whatever, then we kind of wasted our time. So I think it's really important. I think one thing I did want to come up was then think about how what's the role of the Network Plus in this. So it isn't the role of the Network Plus to necessarily fix problems in existing implementations. However, in somehow evaluating things to provide, I don't know, let's call it a reference stack or an example that people can then use in the context of how all these things glue together. There's some gray area there where some of this may fit in, and there'll be I don't know, some clever thinking needed to make sure it's within the scope of the project. Yeah. But I think there are also things here that if there are other communities that are very interested in this, whether it be Dirac or it be Iris or outside those are the things I know about. But beyond that, where I think we have a shared interest in getting these things to do what we want. Yeah.
I would like to see people applying for funding to say, oh, we'll set up a small project to work on this and fix it and make it better. And then there will be a lot of communities that will benefit from that, like sort of with them. So for generic tools of community AI connecting into infrastructure AI.
Yeah, I think, if you've got, like, let's say 3 communities, so we want to explore whether this is a tool that can help us collaborate, that kind of fits within the scope, and the result of it is an evaluation of the technology as a tool, and it can highlight the gaps. It may patch some of the holes along the way, but there are ways to put some of this into the scope. So that.
So, really great talk. I mean, to me, what I really liked, you started with like a very simple pictures, and then you have 3 slides of the bullet points to do. But so I'm not going to go into detail. What is sort of fascinating for me when you are sort of picking on the Iris IM logging is going back to EOSC AI document. I think the very first one that was written, it had 3, I don't know, they call them guiding principle or basic principles. And I think one of them was all trust flows through the community, which is your group and other membership. So what I'm saying is that the principles are very simple. It was like all trust flows through the communities. user experience is the only measure of success or the main measure of success or something along those lines. And then there is no center in a distributed world. So I think what I'm really trying to sort of give feedback to, the community is not ignoring that, because I think you were part of that author list of that. I think it was a very short paper. The thing I struggle it when we see implementation, and majority of these 3 guiding principles, which you for community in itself wrote, why they are kind of, it's just lack of time, pressure, work, or these things like that. And I can, if anyone has time or is interested, you can go to EOSC AI document. I think it was written up back in 2020, and it highlights these principles really very clearly. So if the AI technologists, practitioners, architecture community realizes those, why we are where we are.
Yeah. And some of it is part of the flow that we ask users to go through the systems and get things and credentials and tokens, which are probably unavoidable. But there are other things like, it's my personal biased opinion that we haven't got the full benefits from using tokens that was promised in Dave.
I'm sorry, I was just to John too.
Okay.
When you're ready.
Okay, so yeah, because we said, okay, we're going to replace SAML with tokens, and SAML is quite complicated, like really complex system, but we're making tokens complex as well. And some of that complexity is hidden behind the scenes, and users don't need to worry about it, but not all of it. Right? So,
yeah. Thanks, Jens. Great. So, is the recommendation that we should all be adopting 8693 delegation?
I think we should be able to support it if we need delegation. So there's a lot of copying bearer tokens around at the moment, which is part of what I'm saying. We haven't got the full benefits promised by the switch to token-based authorization. And some of those, if we had token exchange, then yes, that would be a better way of managing things. But we also need better ways of managing the policies for when you're allowed to change the token.
But the carrier mechanism, you prefer delegation. You think that RFC is the one to target?
I think there's potential in it. Yes,
yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Definitely. And I think the potential isn't always well understood in the community either. Because if you go and play along with this one, you actually get a bearer token. So the whole authorization, as you can see in this slide, is a bearer token that is just being passed in. And so the whole thing about when you log into an HPC system and you need a credential forwarded on that connection, then you either need to use the forwarding mechanism in OIC agent, or you need some sort of like GSI SSH mechanism that gets a delegated token on your behalf that can do stuff. And then that token needs to go into your job that needs to run on different nodes inside the HPC system and stuff. So we need to think about these things.
I think one of the benefits we've been playing with this at Hartree, and one of the benefits we've seen of the delegation tokens is that the processes that run are as the user rather than as a service account.
Yeah, and I think that so that's a good point. Like when we try to squeeze people into Podman and stuff on systems. Yeah.
Joe.
Is actually Stephen's going to jump in.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Right. Just another comment. I mean, one of the experiences I've actually had from being the community IDP in providing Dirac to Iris is there is a need for sort of an organization to coordinate communities a little bit. I mean, for example, in order to issue group information to Iris, I'm going to have a URN, to issue under, and there's a certain amount of coordination of the federation that's going to be needed, as well as just the technical stuff.
So the group needs to exist, and it has to have some structure and coordination to it.
Yes, and there's got to be a procedure for managing that and agreeing, these are the groups that I mean, if you do it all in a single monolithic system, then it's easy because you just go to the central portal and create the group. But if you want a federation with a diversity of technologies, these things have to, there needs a process around that. I've got to be able to say, okay, what groups am I going to issue to IAM, without actually, how do we agree those, and it's just process, it's governance.
Yeah. And there's a bit of plumbing in it as well when you get different groups with different acceptable use policies, and the service needs to get you into a system based on which one you've signed. So we haven't even
yes,
and
precisely.
And a user accessing that service should not be directed back to a community without a strong enough assurance behind it.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, this is part of the, the policy work that you need. You have to set out what are the rules to be a group that is there, and how will you behave? What will you do to make sure that, the example always comes to mind is a misbehaving user who's perhaps, I don't know, hosting their copyrighted materials and distributing them without an appropriate license on your data service, and you detect this and you need to cut them off. And then you need to have a rule with the group that explains how you're going to deal with that. Or it could be about security incident response and how you respond to that. Once you go to that distributed federated system where you're delegating out to those groups have to take on some responsibilities, and that does have implications. We were talking yesterday, I think, how do we put it? There are sacrifices that you have to make in order to be part of the federation, and maybe it's not the right word for this particular thing, but there's responsibilities you have to take on.
Yeah.
As part of it that you didn't have to do when you were running your own cluster in your cupboard.
Yeah.
And not using the sort of pooled resources of the federation.
But we've had that all the way back in NGS things.
Sure, yeah, no, I mean, we've been through these things, but not every community has been through that loop, and there will be, I think, enthusiastic groups who will want to be part of this thing, and they will hit this like a wall. We'll say, hang on, you need us to do what? We have to organize around this. We have to sign that. We have to do this, and we've got to somehow understand how that can be managed so that it doesn't feel like a barrier to participation, I think. Yes. Other comments or questions?
I mean, this is just like a comment based on experience. So yeah, it is important that we need governance, we need tooling, we need everyone to be, we had the EOS talk, we had the science. We can define a target state, and initially when you start, for instance, you take on some role. So I think it's part of the service architecture more than the technology architecture, when you may be initially building things in-house because they needed to be built, but you design the service architecture so you can then give them to people who actually own that governance piece. I'm not going to say until it's done. In this current setup we are doing with it, is a Bard AI or other thing, there is a part of architecture or a tool or dashboard, whatever you can end up calling from a governance point of view, that UKRI will have to manage because they own the resources, they own the capacity, they decide who gets it. Currently, we are building it in-house because it doesn't exist. However, I'm not building it as part of my service, closer to service solution where I have acceptable usage policy. It doesn't make sense, as you say, acceptable usage policy is shown to the user on the top level governance platform. So yeah, so I think maybe there are some practices or reference architecture, I don't know what else to call it, that where we think of these principles, I don't know what, but we know these things should not sit within the entity if your ultimate destination is a federation. But if you wait for everything to be ready and you don't do it yet, then you also have a problem.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.